commercial burglary, residential robbery, and vehicle theft. What if you could prevent these crimes from happening before they happened? What if you could predict when and where these crimes would occur to give the police department one step ahead of the criminal? What if you could use data mining to predict when and where these crimes would occur in order to prevent them from happening? That is exactly what a group of researchers from the University of Massachusetts, Boston attempted to do in this case study. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noah Schubert, and today I'll be presenting a data mining case study entitled What If? During this presentation, I'll be going over the executive summary, the problem that the researchers faced, the key challenge that the researchers encountered when attempting to solve the problem, the solution to the problem, the implementation of the solution to the problem, and a possible alternative solution that I've developed. To begin, I'll go over the executive summary. In 2011, a city in the Northeast, which remains unnamed due to the sensitivity of the data, recorded about 70% of all property crime within the city was reported. This is much higher than violent crime and presented a problem for the city. The solution was the researchers developed data mining models in order to help the police department make wiser resource allocation and staffing decisions to help them lower the crime rate. The implementation involved running each algorithm and using the results from each algorithm collectively to help determine when and where each crime would occur to prevent it from happening before it happened. The deployment, however, has not yet begun. The research team is waiting on additional funding, as well as hoping that the local government will implement a data sharing program to make it easier for the researchers to pull data, pre-process, and clean it much faster than they did during this case study. Next, I'll go over the problem that the researchers faced. As I mentioned earlier, the city had encountered high rates of property crime. Approximately 70% of all reported crime within the city was property crime. The police department needed help to make wiser resource allocation and staffing decisions. Typically, with violent crimes, the violent crime rate in this city was particularly low. So the police department was able to use strictly intelligence to know or get a good idea of when and where the crime would occur in order to help stop it. However, because the property crime rate was so high, the police department needed another tool to help them to determine when and where these crimes would take place and to help stop them. They needed to know when the crime would occur, where the crime would occur, and what type of crime would be committed. This was the problem that faced these researchers. The key challenge that the researchers faced was they had to collect, clean, and pre-process the data from many different sources within the local government. This made it very difficult for them and took long periods of time in order to get all this data into one single form and format in order to run data mining algorithms on it. Secondly, they had to figure out and determine the crime grid. They had to determine the size as well as the predictors or categories that they would use to predict crime. The crime grid was a way to divide the city into multiple cells to make it easier for the algorithms to run the data. The researchers tested two types of crime size grids. The first was a 21 by 20 grid, where each cell was about a half a mile long. The second grid they tested was a 41 by 40 grid, where each cell was about a quarter mile long. The categories or predictors that were used included vehicle larceny that had happened in a particular cell, previous arrests or previous crime that had occurred in that city or area, and foreclosures within that city all were used as predictors in order to classify when and where crimes would occur to predict them before they happened. Another challenge underneath this cleaning and pre-processing data was they had to figure out how to handle empty cells. For example, a lake. Property crime doesn't occur on a lake, and so the researchers had to figure out what to do with these empty cells. They made the algorithm have higher accuracy rates, which tainted the goal, which was to predict where crime would occur. So they had to remove the empty cells in order to allow the model to be more accurate and to accomplish their goal. Lastly, they had to balance hot and cold spots. For most people, crime does not occur that often. It is a rare event. Therefore, cold spots are much more common than hot spots. For the purposes of the algorithm, the models were trying to figure out where hot spots in the city were. It's easy for the algorithm to figure out the cold spots because nothing's happening there. It's more difficult for the algorithms to determine something happening, and so they had to weight the hot spots for them to equal the cold spots in numbers so that the models would be more accurate. Next, I'll discuss the solution that the researchers developed. These researchers used multiple data mining algorithms in order to help them get an idea of when and where these crimes would occur. They used data or events from last month in order to predict the current month's crime. They used several models to do this, some of which included one nearest neighbor with a location constraint, decision tree, support vector machine, neural network, and naive Bayes. No conclusions were drawn from these results or from this solution. This was simply a preliminary test run of the crime forecasting model to understand if this would even work. And so the researchers drew no hard, fast conclusions about which model was better than the other. However, they did use something called ensemble learning or stabilized voting in order to get a better idea of when and where crimes would occur. The idea behind ensemble learning is that using the results from several different models, you get a better idea of exactly when and where the crime will occur. Instead of relying on one model's results, you can rely on 3 or 4 results, and that makes the result of that model much more effective and efficient. The implementation of this involved running each of these algorithms over multiple months of data to see how each of the models would react. For example, they used each previous month's data, for example, 9 months, to predict October's crime. They used one nearest neighbor as a baseline for which to test each of the model's results against. Although they did not draw hard, fast conclusions about which model worked better than the other, they did realize that they could nail down the crime grid size. In every single model tested, the 21 by 20 crime grid worked far better than the 41 by 40 crime grid. This allows further testing. Once additional funding is obtained, they will have a better understanding of how to test going forward, knowing the crime grid size within the city. Deployment has not begun, however, because the researchers are waiting on additional funding for their models in order to further test them and implement them into the police department system. And they are also hoping that the local government will institute a data sharing program, which will limit the amount of time spent cleaning, collecting, and pre-processing the data in order to run it through the algorithms. I agree with the way that the researchers went about attempting to solve this problem. I agree with the solution, and I agree with the process that they used to get to that solution. However, I think clustering could have been used in order to get an idea of where the hotspots are within the city. Clustering is a form of non-supervised machine learning that allows the data mining or data scientist to see particular areas that have common characteristics. So for example, this might be helpful within the city. crime has many common characteristics, and you could even use the same events or predictors that the research team used. For example, areas in the city that have high number of arrests, or a high number of foreclosures. These would be grouped together, and so the location of the hotspots would be known based on where the high number of foreclosures is located. That would help the research team visualize where the hotspots are within the city. However, clustering is not a predictive data mining algorithm. It is simply a historical classification and a way to visualize events or records with common characteristics. In conclusion, we can and we are getting to the point where we can predict when and where crimes will happen. However, additional funding is needed in order to further test these results, but this research team is on the verge of something that could be amazing. Our question from the beginning, what if you could use data mining to prevent crime, is becoming a reality. Thank you. I will take any questions in the comment section below.